Let's look at a 25-year-old drum that illustrates what DW did in the past to make them the brand that they are today. DW Drums has such a rich history that is rooted in the beginning of the modern drum set. George Way was this dude building drums in Indiana who was really, really innovative. That name and a lot of the patents with it now are owned by Ron Dennett. But when George Way ended, that company turned into Camco, which wound up being one of the most high-end drum sets you could buy coming out of the Chicagoland area. You had Slingerland, you had Ludwig, you had Leedy in the area, but then Camco was building these drums south of the city that were just amazing in the 60s. Later, they were bought out by Custom with a K, the guitar amplifier company, moved to Kansas. From Kansas, they're bought out again and moved to Los Angeles. That company then was producing what are known as some of the most wonderful sounding studio drums ever made. It's referred to as the Camco LA shell. 6 plies of maple, 6 ply re-ring. Now, when that company kind of was kaput, then Tama bought some of the patents, and then DW, Don Lombardi, wound up buying whatever else was there as far as intellectual property was concerned. That was the start of DW. Its roots are so deep, and moving forward, they really wanted to root themselves in that same sort of heritage of high-end, great products that really continue to innovate year after year, and they've done that. Look what they're doing now. They're working on wireless electronic drum sets now that Roland's bought them out. Crazy, crazy stuff. But to me, the golden era of their acoustic drums was in the 90s. They had a shell that they were doing through Keller. Keller gets a bad rep, but that was a shell supplier that was making the shells for Rogers. And Rogers Drums is a vintage brand that is known for the quality of their drum shells. Listen, Keller, not a bad thing. And what DW was doing was certainly not a bad thing. It was a great thing. They're very, very sought after. Some of the most sought after drums that were made in the 90s. Here we have what is really another glaring example of why what DW is doing in the 90s is so important. The guys at DW teamed up with Johnny Craviotto, who was a drum builder. He was doing restorations. As far as what I know about the history is, there were a few folks who were doing restorations on vintage Radio King drums. And why those snares are so important is they're steam bent. So they're not plies. They're not these really thin plies of wood. It's a one real thicky piece of wood that's put in a steam box so it gets floppy enough that you can turn it into a circle. And then you do a few things to make sure that that shell stays around for 100 years forward. The Slingerland drums are wonderful because it was the first illustration that instead of plied drums, these solid shell drums, from one to another, one individual drum to another, they sounded completely different. And I have a feeling that's why Johnny originally fell in love with them. So Johnny got into restoring these drums and sort of hot rodding them. One really famous drummer who was known to have used hot rodded Radio King snares was Steve Smith with Journey. Back in the 80s, I heard that he was using, I don't know who built his, if it was Steve himself. There was a custom shop out in California called Valley Arts who was doing a lot of custom drums. I actually used to own a snare drum, the snare drum that was used on the Ghostbusters theme song, and that was a Valley, I believe it's called Valley Arts Custom Shop product. But wherever it came from, it started this trend of bringing back what was the professional snare drum of the the original, the advent of the modern drum set. Moving forward, Johnny, I don't know which came first, it's sort of chicken or the egg, because I'm not too familiar with the history, but I don't know if he was doing just these shells for DW first, or if he had started a drum company called Solid Drum Company, which really started to do these shells en masse. Eventually, that became what's known as sort of one of the most high-end drum builders, wood drum builders of today, Craviotto Drum Company, which they have snare drums that go for thousands of dollars. They have full kits that go for tens of thousands of dollars, and it's because of the process of making them and the love that goes into them. It's heavy. It's heavy, heavy, heavy. And with this drum, you can certainly hear that. So this is, I think, about a 5.5-ish. That's a very technical term. 5.5-ish depth drum, 14 diameter, 10 tube lugs, maple shell, 1/4 inch with a re-ring, steam bent. Listen to this drum. Every once in a great while, I play a snare drum that changes the way that I play when I'm behind it and the way that I think about drums generally. This drum tonally reminds me of a pork pie wood snare that I played 3 years ago at Music Around in Kenosha, Wisconsin. That drum sounds great, but I wasn't able to purchase it. I for whatever reason, I didn't go back and buy the drum, and I wish I would have. Now, fortunately, this thing sounds just about the same as the pork pie, but what's even greater about this drum is that it has an incredibly wide tuning range. Something I don't know that you can generally get out of a plied drum and retain the amount of body, I guess you could say the amount of tone, that you get out of the shell. So check this thing out at a lower tuning range. It's just stupid, and we're not doing anything fancy here, folks. I have the Evans UV2 head on top. It's got the original DW snare side head, and it looks like the original wires too. Despite having what feels like a very, very basic setup on this drum, I can take it from that low of a pitch and crank it up and get just as wonderful a high pitch out of the drum. If you look back at some of the other snare drum sort of spotlight type videos I've made, this wood drum is one of the most outstanding drums that I've used on this channel. Now, why? I don't know. Maybe it's this particular piece of wood is just that wonderful. Maybe it's the bearing edge that helps contribute to creating a tone that sounds good. Maybe it's just the magic that Johnny poured into making this drum 25 years ago. I don't know. But what I do know is that when you find a drum like this and it speaks to you as a player, don't let it go. I'm going to try to talk Dennis into selling me this drum. I don't know if he's going to, but Dennis was very, very kind to send me home with this to try it out today. Dennis being the guy behind Turkish Cymbals USA. As always, just about always, I'm using my Turkish cymbals today. 15-inch Millennium hats, 20-inch Metacrash, 22-inch Millennium Ride, and a 24 like super thin prototype dark dry type of thingy ding. Wonderful cymbals, wonderful guy, and thank you, Turkish Cymbals USA, for lending me this drum to play. I hope you learned a little bit more. And now, next time you're hunting for your next snare drum, go to the local shops and see if you can find something used, something different, something ultimately that makes you sound like you in the best way you can imagine. All right, guys, have a good one.